It's always recommended for CEOs or founders to get coaches to help them execute on building up their business, but there aren't that many coaches out there for venture capitalists themselves.
So the challenge if you're doing first check investing is you have to become findable and sometimes willing to say things that other VC won't. We're going to spend a whole bunch of time dancing around it. You need a check, right? You sort of run through your saving, have aspirations to hire 8 people. I know what this is about. People will find you, but maybe not the best founders. If all you do is reactively deal with who's in your inbox, that might not be the best, but it'll suck up a lot of time. The thing where founders run into the biggest issues, I divide founders into 3 categories.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's episode of the Liberty Ventures podcast. My name is Alexander McCobin. I'm the founder and CEO of Liberty Ventures. And with this podcast, we are working to share inspiring and insightful stories and lessons from members of the Liberty Ventures ecosystem, with the purpose being to bring together values-aligned business leaders, investors, executives, and entrepreneurs who are all committed to a free and prosperous future to help you scale your business, to scale your impact. And I am thrilled to be talking today with Charlie O'Donnell, who has an illustrious career in the venture capital space, having run Brooklyn Bridge Ventures for 2 decades before actually, I think, very intentionally deciding to stop doing venture capital yourself so that you can help coach and advise others to be more successful in this space. And Charlie, I just love that graduation of responsibilities and roles you've taken on for yourself, and really appreciate you jumping on this conversation to share some of those insights with the Liberty Ventures community in their pursuit of being entrepreneurs, being venture capital investors, and trying to make a positive impact in the world.
No problem. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
So I really want to start because you have such an interesting story with your story. I'm wondering if you could give us a couple of minutes of just what has led to who you are today and what you're doing now in coaching other people in venture capital today.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in New York, as we were just mentioning before we started. And look, at the end of the day, Wall Street looms large. And as I was growing up, that was the place where, at least in my circle, smart, ambitious people went to go work. And so there was definitely sort of a pull. Both my brothers were in the brokerage industry. And so that's where I sort of initially pointed, not really knowing about all of the different areas of finance and definitely not knowing anything about venture capital at the time. I wound up getting an internship at the General Motors pension fund. So my high school just luckily had an internship program where at the 3rd trimester of our senior year, they kind of kicked us out. They sort of knew that we had already applied to our schools and weren't going to be paying attention anymore. So rather than have us sort of sit around and cause trouble, they got us working. And I wound up at a large institutional investor. Unbeknownst to me, GM had been a backer of venture capital funds dating back to I'm going to say 1979 or something like that. I mean, really, really early Silicon Valley stuff. And so after bouncing around a bunch of different areas of the pension fund, when I graduated, the area that just happened to have an opening was the venture capital and private equity asset class. And so I got to work with that team and got to be really front and center in a number of interesting funds pitching us. It was really interesting timing because I started in February 2001. And so I actually saw 10 negative quarters of performance in venture capital before I ever saw a positive one, because it was just the post-dot-com crash write-downs trying to save what was left of these companies and all that sort of stuff.
It actually sounds like a great time to get into it because you saw the worst at the very beginning.
Yeah, and it was not a time where there was a lot of competition to get into it either, right? Everybody was going in the other direction. But I stayed long enough to also see the beginning of that next cycle, right? Where we had to make decisions about, okay, 2004, all our venture funds are coming back to market. Are we still in this? Are we still in this asset class? And look, not every limited partner decided to do that, right? Some literally exited the whole asset class, sold all their stuff. Other people decided to pare down. We stayed committed. We even came into some emerging managers. We decided that, some of our portfolio was a little long in the tooth, and sometimes, there were new managers that we can sort of go into. And that was how I met the team from Union Square Ventures, because Fred Wilson and Brad Burnham actually pitched me when I was the lowly analyst on the team in 2004 when they were raising their first fund. Pounded the table heavily for us to make an investment. Wasn't a fit for our size. We were kind of a little too big for them. So I wound up very frustratingly writing an email to Fred and saying, what does a junior person even do at a venture fund? And Fred's response after going through the due diligence process with me, luckily, I guess I performed well, at least on my side of the table. He said, you want to come and find out? And that was basically it. I became the first analyst at Union Square. Great time to get started in New York when the ecosystem was pretty new and there was lots of opportunity to get to know people. And stayed there for a couple of years, moved on to try my own hand at entrepreneurship. Wasn't really particularly good at it, but not unlike some of the best baseball managers who weren't necessarily the best players. I realized I was much better on the venture side. So I helped First Round Capital open up their New York office and spent a couple of years there, and then decided to break out on my own to start Brooklyn Bridge Ventures.
So there's so many things I want to dig into there, but the fact that you actually got your start in going to a venture capital firm thanks to a company pitching you, and then you went back and pitched yourself to them, I think is a really fascinating story that highlights for a lot of people the importance of relationships and how so many opportunities in life come from a direction that we would not expect them to. Because I imagine when they came into your office to begin with, you weren't thinking that you would one day go work for them, right?
No, and in fact, like quite the opposite. I think, as a 24-year-old, I really didn't appreciate the sort of longer term nature of networking and relationship building. Like, to me, it was all about just like getting that next job, right? So I had a really huge networking opportunity that I will fully admit that I missed to a large extent, because we invested in like large private equity funds and we were in the Blackstones and Apollos and all this sort of stuff. And because I didn't necessarily want to do that job, I didn't really connect with those people. And granted, like, not every private equity partner was my cup of tea, and, didn't always align on, values and all of that sort of stuff. But some were really, terrific people. And I think I probably should have spent more time focused on the folks for whom, I felt were, kind of good people trying to do the right thing. And so, when I met the guys at Union Square, I just got to know them a little bit more personally, because I had been starting to publicly write. I started what, was then we called blogging. Now it's newsletters, who knows what you want to call it. But I started my blog in February of 2004, about 3 months after Fred Wilson started his in November. And so we got a chance to sort of back channel a lot. And not just about tech and investing, but, about things we care about, things we wanted to see for New York. They felt like they knew me pretty well by the time any kind of interview for professional reasons, would have happened, because they got to see my insights through that sort of public sharing. And so that was a major factor. And when I asked, to be honest, I wasn't really pitching myself. I was actually literally asking the question of what a junior person in VC does. I did not expect him to say, you want to come and find out. But I was very excited to get that response.
Now, you have been blogging and putting a lot of stuff out there for a long time. I love reading your blog. And I am curious if that was either intentionally or unintentionally part of the strategy you had as a venture capitalist in order to identify opportunities, whether that was deal flow or LPs or just continue to build out your business and what you were doing?
Yeah, I think it wasn't necessarily a strategy. I kind of coach a lot of people on thought leadership, and I always tell people, look, it has to work for you first. And so, if it doesn't work for you, then you're not going to be as good at it, and it's not going to be a great marketing arm for whatever you're kind of doing. And for me, like, writing is how I process stuff. And, over the course of my life, like, I've had a lot of things that sort of needed processing. I mean, for example, like just growing up in New York in during the late 80s, early 90s, like, crime was always the big thing. And I grew up fairly conservatively, for example. And, over time, I, have moved off of that and become much more progressive over time. But there are things that I used to think very deeply that I've had to change and not maybe do a 180, maybe do a 90-degree angle, maybe, sort of pick and choose and what have you. And I think through writing about this and getting feedback from other folks has been really important to both my personal development, but also my professional development, is just trying to understand, like, hey, well, what's being said about startup companies, what are sort of the what is said to be the best practices, where are points where I disagree, and sort of work through those. And it happened to have aligned with being a first check investor, because the challenge there is you can't look up the companies that I invested in on Crunchbase before they announce their fundraising round. They sort of like don't exist until they get a check to put some money in the bank, and they get to stop working on their full-time jobs and work on this startup, right? So the challenge, if you're doing first check investing, is you have to become findable. And so I realized that my public thinking, my being a public student over time, and my public processing was also just helpful to founders, right? I've backed, for example, a fairly diverse portfolio of founders, which is, mostly a function of a being first check, right? So I'm not dependent on somebody else's curation of the world. So I'm just much more open to sort of like that. And, I've done a lot of thinking about, what different types of founders face in the fundraising process and what I've experienced. And sometimes I'll say stuff that gets a lot of pushback from the kinds of people that I want to work with, but I think they appreciate the fact that I'm at least trying to process and think about this sort of stuff, and sometimes willing to say things that that other VCs won't. So if nothing else, if somebody reads my writing, I think they know they're going to get direct feedback and honesty and transparency, and not just sort of, VC hand-wavy fluff. Hopefully they take that well.
Hopefully, but it also puts out there the kind of people that you want to work with, because you're very direct about your approach to the world in this. Got to say, I loved your blog post, why it's good to be transactional, because so many people talk about, oh, it's relationship building, you never want to be transactional, instead of understanding that the way you actually build meaningful relationships is to have transactions in there too. And that was so on point there.
Yeah, and I think it comes from the perspective, like, respecting people's time. Right? Like, I don't want to only be valued because I can write a check, or at least I could write a check previously. I'm choosing not to now. But so, I want people to, value me for other things besides that. But I also don't want to be in a conversation where you're pretending that you're not fundraising. Right? That's just like, in some way, that's like, we're going to spend a whole bunch of time dancing around it, and it's disrespectful of my time. And look, like, who am I kidding, right? Like, that's probably why you contacted me. If, hey, I'd love to get some feedback from my company. I don't know. You probably get a lot of feedback. Like, you need a check, right? You sort of run through your savings. You have aspirations to hire 8 people. I happen to be a venture capitalist. Like, I know what this is about. and it's still cutting to the point. I think just clarifies everything, and also in some way I think there's a value to making certain things not personal, right? Like, look, I'm here to allocate my investors' funds into the best companies. That's what I'm trying to do. If I say no, it's not because I don't like you. It's not because we didn't build a relationship. It's just because you didn't make the case you were one of those best companies. Or I misinterpreted the case. Either way, like, that's what we're here for. We can still be very cordial when we run into each other in the scene. We can still, you can ask me a follow-up question or ask me for an introduction if you think it'd be helpful. But, we kind of have a job to do, and let's focus on that.
Here, here. I love that. And I hope everyone listening to this takes that lesson to heart. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, and you didn't really talk about this in your bio, but let's dig into it. The fact that you actually closed down your fund a couple of years ago, Brooklyn Bridge Ventures, and have graduated this year, actually. Okay, so that recently, I'm really curious to hear more about why you decided to do that, why you're now in this coaching role for other people in venture capital, and how that's been for you so far.
So, it's a couple things. First of all, when I started this business, and I was 32, 33, single and no kids, and had a just very different lifestyle, and I was sort of running around to every startup event, frankly throwing a lot of the startup events myself, and panels, and happy hours, and what have you. Trying to be everywhere, trying to be very findable, trying every new app, and spending a lot of after hours time researching, looking around, and all of that sort of stuff. And it's fairly all consuming, right? And the same thing goes for when you do actually invest in a company, right? Founders run into problems. They say, hey, we can't launch tomorrow because, our servers are down, and what do we do? And how do we deal with this? This newspaper is expecting to write to us, and, or this funding fell through, or what have you. So it's kind of an always on job. From what I see, when people progress and they get to the, in their 40s with a kid, married, whatever, they do one of two things. They either go later stage, they basically narrow the aperture, and they say, well, don't come talk to me until you have, $1 million in revenue, or what have you. And so this way they just don't have to talk to as many companies in the top of the funnel. They can spend less time doing that. Or they build a team, right? They go hire the 27-year-old that I used to be, running around and going to turn over every rock and all of that sort of stuff. And I just don't want to do either of those things. Like, I really loved being solo. I've been on some really great teams, but I can honestly say I probably wasn't the best team player. I didn't love having to ask other people if I could do an investment. Even the sports I play softball, and it's a turn-based thing, and I'm standing in the outfield and I catch the ball, and I don't really have to coordinate the same way you have to do in like a basketball game or whatever. And I play ice hockey. I'm the goalie, right? I'm my own individual little guy in the back, and they're all coordinating with each other. I just try and stop the puck if it comes to me, right? So I am like, as despite the number of teams I'm on, I'm not necessarily very team focused, and so I liked being an individual. And I'm probably also just like, I like being early to something. I like being able to say that I was there at two people at a prototype, right? I like the fact that I can tell a story of how when GroupMe, the group messaging app, began, it was a hackathon project at the TechCrunch Disrupt hackathon. And I was there at the hackathon, and, was sort of the first VC to see it, and help them close their initial round. It's fun. It garners a different sense of pride than when you like led the Series B and it was already clearly a not to discount the people who take that kind of risk, but it's fun to be there for the beginning. And so I I didn't really want to do either of those two things. And so I just took an honest look and said, well, if I can't do the thing I really love well and the way I want to do it, I should probably be doing something else. And the other thing I really like is coaching and helping others. I do see, VC as a service business. And I definitely, I'm just somebody who, if I see somebody that needs help, I'm, one of those New Yorkers that always sees tourists in the street and clearly lost. And I'm like, okay, where are you going? Like, I can't walk by you going in circles, standing with the map on your phone. I sort of feel this compulsory need to be helpful because I just can't, leave people adrift. And so, I decided to take this into coaching, or actually I got asked by people who I knew to coach them. And I can't say that I like intentionally said, I'm going to open up a coaching practice, right? And I wound up writing one piece on why don't more investors have coaches? Because we certainly recommend coaching to a lot of founders. And I just got a windfall of inbound. I mean, I still, from that original post, probably get 3 or 4 people coming in a week, like unsolicited. And it's been a lot of fun. I feel like I've been able to take my experience and be very helpful to them. And I'm really enjoying it. I really have, I've put aside a couple of other intended projects to spend more time coaching because I'm really, really enjoying it and finding it very valuable.
So you're absolutely right. It's always recommended for CEOs or founders to get coaches to help them execute on building up their business, but there aren't that many coaches out there for venture capitalists themselves. So how are you approaching this? What do you consider to be some of the most important things that you work with people on with this kind of coaching?
So one of them is probably more at the core of it is time allocation. And it's not just like, what are the hacks for being more efficient? I feel like that's a TikTok or an Instagram meme or whatever, right? You want to be the efficient tech bro or what have you. It's more like, does where you are currently spending your time align on where you think the opportunities and where you think you're being more efficient? And that's really where it is, because VC is sort of a unique job in the sense that, like, you could be completely unintentional and spend next to no time putting yourself out there. And just by the nature of, like, you are at a firm that has a brand or you get on some list, you will have lots of inbound in your inbox, right? Like, just you give away money for a living and, you buy equity, but you're kind of giving away money for a living. And people will find you, but maybe not the best founders. And if all you do is sort of reactively deal with who's in your inbox, that might not be the best group of people that you're dealing with, but it'll suck up a lot of time. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about, like, where do you think the opportunities will be? How do you spend more time in that area? Do the people who you think you need to know you well enough? Let's be more intentional about the time you spend. And then I think the other thing that people wind up spending a lot of time on is their brand, their lane. Sometimes on the earlier stage side, if you're talking to like a senior associate, like, they don't really know whether they want to spend time on infrastructure and dev tools or, consumer stuff or whatever. And they're just trying to figure out a thesis. And I spoke yesterday to one of my clients who has a $30-40 million fund, and we were just walking through their website of how they described themselves, and I was asking these very pointed questions about, like, but are those the type of founders that you're going after? Or, like, if I was that type of founder, which you just described to me you want to meet, is it obvious that I'm that kind of founder if I just read the words on your website? Not totally clear. And so we're sort of aligning messaging and working on that. But it's fun, and everybody's a little bit of a different challenge.
I would absolutely imagine, and I love your emphasis on just making sure you're finding the best deals, whether from what you're doing, going out there, or making sure it's coming in the right way because of the brand that's being established. I'm curious, you just mentioned one of the things that you have been working with some on is developing their thesis, or that this is one of the most common questions for new VC funds or angel networks. What's the thesis for this? And I'm curious how you help them think through developing their thesis, if that's one of the things you work on.
Yeah, it's got to be an alignment of a few things. There's actually there's a Japanese term. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. I have been pronouncing it as ikigai, but I'm not sure if that's the right. It's these sort of four overlapping circles of doing what you love, doing what you can make money on, doing what the world needs, and doing what you're good at. I think that's the four things, right? And the ikigai, the sort of life purpose, your true calling is the thing that checks all those boxes, is the thing that's sort of in the middle. And so I try and make sure I'm asking all of those questions, right? It's incomplete to say, well, AI seems to be the hot thing, so I'll go and be an AI investor, if you don't care about it, frankly. Like if that's just not interesting to you, or if you don't have the technical skills to be a differentiated investor along those lines, then that's really going to be tough as a calling, because you're just not going to be as good at it as somebody who aligns better. And so we really try and take that like holistic view of all of those things. And I think it's important for just anybody going into venture to really consider all of the aspects of the job. Certainly there's great returns to be had if you are successful in this industry. But like the service piece, right? Being a person for others who cares about other people and who is emotionally empathetic to founders and how difficult this is. And like that kind of thing is just as important, because frankly, you'll spend a lot more time showing care and understanding and empathy than you will making money or thinking about ways to make money or whatever, right? Because this is a squishy human game, and people are they sometimes get in the way of themselves and have a lot of ups and downs to deal with, and you're there for that part too. And so if you're only interested in part of it versus another part, it's just going to be hard to be really good at it.
So I love that. I have actually just been reading Ikigai myself, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly or not, but that seems so on point for not only our life purpose, but for each fund's purpose as well. Thanks for bringing that in here.
No problem.
Now, I'm also curious from the other side. We're talking about coaching for venture capitalists, but you also worked with a lot of founders yourself, in your time as at running a VC fund. I'm curious if you're willing to share any advice for founders who are listening to this in terms of any most common problems you saw them come in their pitches with you, or things that you just give as recommendations to anyone that you did invest in for how to build their business.
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, the things where I see founders run into the biggest issues, I divide founders into three categories. The first division is smart and not smart. And that's just sort of an easy one, right? This is like an intellectually challenging thing that some people are just not up for. And they have other skill sets, but like this, you need a certain amount of, it's not even processing capacity, it's speed, right? This all moves so fast. There's a certain being able to make decisions with incomplete information, so I'm overly simplifying it to just say smart, right? There's just a certain mental skills that you need to be able to do this, right? So you make that one division, right? That's an easy one. You can kind of tell most of the time, like who's up for it and who's not. Within that smart category, there's has done their homework and who hasn't. And that's actually really hard, right? Because there are some smart people who are very eloquent and persuasive that haven't spent enough time in their space, haven't talked to enough customers. I remember this one founder who was trying to like fix the software that teachers used to run their classrooms in school, which, look, everybody knows that Blackboard sucks. We've all experienced it. It's still in there and embedded in these institutions. Nobody likes using it, right? But there's a reason why it's there. And there's a non-obvious reason that you as a student wouldn't understand, right? So if you approach that and you say, well, I'm just going to make something better, and the better is easier to use from a user experience perspective, right? That doesn't solve the buyer's problems, right? That doesn't, like, you haven't spoken to the person in IT who made the decision, or the whatever decision maker, the CIO who said, like, this is the thing that we are going with. Not only were you not there for the decision why they bought this thing, but you've never had a conversation with them, so you don't really understand why they would ever take it out and what they perceive as the risk factors and all of this thing, right? Because, you know, institutional tech, whether it's government or education, whatever, like they're not paid on the upside, right? And so for them, they just want to make sure that the vendor they're using continues to exist next year. They're less concerned with whether or not it's the best software on the planet. And so you can come in with that approach. And so it was just really easy to pick out folks who were like, no, like you need to go talk to the buyer and get to know them much better, because your pitch it's too easy to poke holes in it because you haven't spent enough time, you haven't spent enough homework. And there's some other people whose whole professional career has been leading up to doing this thing. I mean, I'm an investor in this company called Radformation that was started by clinicians who worked in radiology labs that literally did the physics calculations to figure out, God forbid you ever needed radiation treatment, what was the like physical path of it on your body, and how deep and how powerful they would need to go to like eliminate a brain tumor, while at the same time trying to preserve your optic nerve so you didn't go blind, or all of that sort of stuff, right? And they would do that manually. And they built software to do that automatically. Like, they were the customer. They did the work that the computer is doing. You could never, ever accuse them of not doing enough homework, because it was their life to do that thing. And so it was not surprising that they were able to grow the business and be successful with it.
That is so insightful, so useful. Thank you again, Charlie, really. And we're coming up at the end of time, but there's one last question I always like to ask, and it starts with the context that I think one of the best ways for people to learn about an industry or to connect with someone is to reach out to someone that they appreciate and just offer to help them out, to give something to do to them. And so I'm really curious, for anyone listening, if they want to get in touch with you, if they want to learn more about this space, what's one thing they could reach out to you and say they want to volunteer to help you do that you would respond positively and excitedly about?
I'll always show up for an interview. And part of that is because, you know, look, to go back to the transactional thing, look, if somebody's just trying to get into venture, I coach right now. Like I literally get paid to help somebody do that. And that's, you know, part of what's putting food on the table while my private companies go through their growth and hopefully one day IPO. But, you know, that's a long-term game, and, you know, they're short-term needs. So I think too often when people ask for help, they don't really think about like, well, okay, if you go for coffee with me, like, what are you getting out of this, right? But if you are sharing that with other communities, or, you know, like, that's helpful, because that is answering the same questions to a whole bunch of other people that I could point to and say, oh, you want to learn how to get into venture? I did an interview with somebody about that. Like, here's the link, here's everything I know about it, or what have you. And it's also helping my portfolio companies. And I think, you know, it's one thing when somebody asks for something. It's another thing to say, hey, I just did a project for one of your portfolio companies and helped them with a go-to-market presentation or strategy or what have you. And I'd love to talk about how I can help your other companies do that. It just shows that you've already, put some credit in the bank, so to speak, before you start on the asking side. It's fine to make all the asks, but maybe that's not the first thing you want to do. And then I would say to the other extent too, these days, I think talking to people who share values is, I think, important. I started a nonprofit kayaking program in Brooklyn, and we kayak on the East River, and it's an all volunteer based program. And so, listen, if you show up for volunteering at the Brooklyn Bridge Park Boathouse, like, I owe you one, because you put some volunteer hours into this program, and I appreciate that, because I care about that community. I care about the environment. Obviously, that's like super timely these days. And, so if people are helping with the kind of causes and things that I care about, that's super meaningful to me.
I love that. And so want to say that we've got some great kayaking out in Pennsylvania, not too far from my old family farm. And so if you ever want to have a field trip for that group onto a different place to go kayaking, let me know. I'd love to help coordinate that and invite you guys on out.
Cool. We'll definitely take you up on that.
Awesome. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for all of this. It's been absolutely incredible. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone else here has. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll talk to you again on the next Liberty Ventures podcast.